I'd always been a fan of history, of old houses with creaky floorboards and hidden secrets. So, when I saw the ad for a night watchman at Blackthorn Manor, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to break out of my monotonous routine and earn a decent paycheck. The job description was simple. Ensure the security of Blackthorn Manor during the night. Keep watch over the property and report any suspicious activity. Competitive pay. Must be reliable. What they didn't mention was the mansion's history, or rather, the reputation it had earned over the years. Blackthorn Manor had long been shrouded in mystery. It was said to be haunted, but the people who lived around it were quick to shrug off the rumors. Still, I couldn't ignore the chill that ran down my spine the first time I saw the place in person. It stood on the edge of town, isolated from the neighboring homes, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow it whole. Its tall, jagged spires reached up toward the sky, and its stone exterior was worn, faded by the passage of time. The windows were dark, lifeless, like eyes watching from the darkness. When I arrived for my first shift, I met the mansion's caretaker, a stoic woman named Evelyn. She was older, in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. She was polite enough, but there was a distance in her gaze, as though she had seen too many things that words could not explain. "The rules here are simple," she said, her voice low and steady. "You'll be alone during the night. No one comes in or out. You're responsible for the perimeter and the inside. Check the security cameras every hour. If you hear anything unusual, stay calm, lock the doors, and contact me immediately." I nodded, trying to keep my nerves in check. Evelyn handed me a set of keys and led me inside. The house smelled of dust, aged wood, and something I couldn't quite place. Something cold, almost metallic. The interior was just as imposing as the exterior. Grand hallways stretched before me, lined with antique furniture that hadn't seen the light of day in years. Portraits of long-dead Blackthorn ancestors stared down from the walls, their eyes eerily lifelike, as though they were judging me for stepping into their domain. Evelyn showed me the security room, tucked away in a back corner of the house. There, she explained the mansion's surveillance system, cameras, motion detectors, and alarms that covered every inch of the building and grounds. She demonstrated how to monitor the feeds and alerted me to a series of buttons that would lock all the doors in the event of an emergency. But the most important part came at the end of her explanation, when she gave me the list of rules. Simple rules, yet her tone made it clear that there was a deeper meaning to them, something I didn't understand. "Do not leave the security room after midnight," she said sternly. "Do not open the west door under any circumstances. If you hear knocking, don't open the door. Don't respond to any whispers or voices, no matter how real they sound. And remember, if you hear anything in the walls, do not investigate. Stay inside the security room until your shift ends." I raised an eyebrow. "The walls?" Evelyn gave me a grave look. "You'll understand soon enough. Just follow the rules." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and dread well up in my stomach. It was just a job, right? I could handle this. After all, I had worked night shifts before. I'd spent hours sitting in dark, empty offices, waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever did. This would be no different. As Evelyn left, she cast one last look at me, her eyes unreadable. "Good luck, young man. And remember, stay inside. Don't wander the halls. The house has a way of calling to you." I didn't quite know what she meant, but as I sat in the small security room, the sounds of the mansion settling around me, I began to wonder if there was more truth to her words than I had first believed. It felt wrong. like the walls were pressing in closer with every passing second, as if they were listening. I glanced at the security monitor, the glow from the screens casting an unnatural light across the room. The cameras were all working fine, but as I scanned the footage, I saw something that made my heart stop. In the top left corner of the monitor, a shadow moved. It wasn't on any of the security feeds, but it was there, lurking at the edge of the frame. I couldn't explain it. My eyes followed it, and then, just like that, it was gone. I quickly turned my attention to the main entrance camera, but there was nothing there, just an empty hallway. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house had eyes, and they were watching me. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creaks and groans that seemed to come from deep within the mansion. I kept myself busy monitoring the security cameras, checking the various feeds from around the house. The mansion was as grand as it was isolated, and the silence seemed almost oppressive. As the minutes ticked by, I tried to keep my mind occupied, focusing on the mundane tasks of the job. But there was something about this place, the way it seemed to watch me, that unsettled me more with each passing second. The hallways felt endless. They stretched on in every direction, dark and twisting, like the mansion had no end. It was easy to get lost, especially when I had never been inside for long enough to really understand its layout. But the longer I stayed in the security room, the more I felt like the mansion was shifting around me, as if it were rearranging itself to trap me. The walls seemed to move, or maybe that was just my imagination. I glanced at the clock on the security panel. Midnight was approaching. The rules Evelyn had given me came flooding back. Do not leave the security room after midnight. I had no intention of wandering the mansion. The thought of stepping out into the dark hallways alone seemed more frightening with each passing minute. But there was something else that nagged at the back of my mind. Evelyn's warning about the west door. The mention of knocking and whispers made my stomach twist in knots. I glanced up at the security monitor again, scanning the camera feeds. The mansion looked as still as ever. The moonlight outside cast long shadows, but nothing moved. Just empty rooms, empty halls, and the quiet hum of the mansion settling around me. I exhaled, trying to calm my nerves. Suddenly, the lights flickered. I looked up, surprised. It wasn't a power outage, just a flicker, but it was enough to make me tense up. I looked at the security monitors again, instinctively checking the exterior cameras. The grounds outside were dark and nothing seemed unusual. Still, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about this place, its silence, its stillness, felt wrong. I stood up from the desk, stretching my legs. I made my way to the window and looked out over the mansion's sprawling grounds. The trees were barely visible in the dark, their twisted branches moving with the wind. The fog had started to roll in, thickening the air around the mansion. I could barely make out the distant outline of the iron gates at the front of the property. A sound broke through the silence, a faint scraping noise like metal against stone. It came from somewhere down the hallway, far off in the distance. I froze, my heart racing. I knew this house. I knew how it settled, how the wind shifted in the walls. But this was different. This wasn't the usual creaking. The sound was deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the mansion. I glanced back at the monitors. The hallways were empty. The camera feed showed nothing out of the ordinary. I stood there for a moment, listening. The scraping sound continued, but it was softer now, like a whisper in the distance. I swallowed hard. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain. I sat back down, my fingers trembling slightly as I adjusted the camera feed again, trying to focus on something, anything, that would distract me from the growing unease that clung to me. My eyes darted between the monitors, scanning the dark halls of the mansion, looking for movement. Suddenly, the scraping noise came again, louder this time. It was closer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just the house settling. This was something else. I stood up quickly, my heartbeat racing. I knew I had to check it out. I had to make sure everything was locked. I had to follow the rules. Stay in the security room. Don't investigate sounds in the house. But there was something about the sound. It was like it was calling me. I felt drawn to it, as if it was pulling me into the dark heart of the mansion. The decision wasn't easy. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the security room door. I could leave. I could ignore it. But the silence that had enveloped the mansion was already suffocating. The longer I stayed in the room, the more the walls seemed to close in on me. I opened the door, stepping into the dark hallway. My footsteps echoed against the cold floorboards, the silence of the house amplifying every sound. I glanced at the clock on my phone. It was 12:15 a.m. I couldn't explain it, but the house felt alive now. The shadows were deeper than they should have been, the air heavier, like I was walking through a fog. The mansion had a pulse, and I could feel it. Every step I took seemed to stir something inside the house, as though it was waking up around me. I followed the sound, trying to pinpoint its source. The scraping noise led me down a long, narrow hallway toward the back of the mansion, toward a door I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't on the blueprints. The west door, the one Evelyn had warned me about. I reached out and touched the door's handle. It was cold, unnaturally so. The scraping had stopped, replaced by a faint tapping. My breath caught in my throat. The door was locked. I turned the handle again, harder this time, but the door wouldn't budge. That's when I heard it. A whisper. "Let me in." The voice was low, barely audible, but it felt like it was right beside me. My pulse quickened, and I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. I hadn't imagined it. That voice was real. I wasn't alone anymore. I stumbled back from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper had come from behind it, from within the house, but there was no one else here. I had checked the security footage moments before. No one had entered. The halls were empty, and yet there was that voice. Low, quiet, but undeniable. "Let me in." I stood there, frozen, the only sound in the house my rapid breathing. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to leave, to retreat back into the security room, lock the door, and wait until morning. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I ignored whatever was happening, it would only get worse. The rules Evelyn had given me, don't leave the security room, don't open the west door, ran through my mind. I had already broken one rule by leaving the room, but I had to know what was behind that door. The tapping started again. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was rhythmic now, almost like a knock, a polite request for entry. But there was nothing polite about the feeling creeping up my spine. My gaze flicked nervously toward the hallway, toward the other doors that lined the corridor. The mansion, which had seemed so quiet before, was now humming with unseen activity. I felt watched from every direction, and I could feel the temperature drop, the chill settling around me like a heavy blanket. I approached the door again, my hand trembling as I reached for the cold brass handle. The whispering voices faded just slightly, but the tapping on the door increased. The walls around me seemed to close in, the house growing closer, as if it were pressing itself against me, urging me to open it. The air felt heavy with anticipation. I pulled back the handle. The door didn't open. It was locked, just as before. The whispering grew louder, as though the house itself was pleading with me. There was no way this was normal. I glanced behind me down the hallway, but the house stood silent, still, as though it was waiting for me to make the next move. I pressed my ear against the door, hoping to hear something, anything, that would make sense of this. The silence stretched out in front of me, and then I heard it again. A muffled voice, this time clearer. "Open it." The voice wasn't familiar. It didn't sound like a person, but more like a presence, something that had been here for a long time. It wasn't just asking, it was demanding. I stood there, my hand frozen on the door. The urge to turn away was overwhelming, but I couldn't bring myself to move. A part of me, against my better judgment, wanted to understand what was happening here. Another part, the rational part, screamed at me to get the hell out of this house, to leave before whatever was trapped in these walls came for me. I made my decision. I stepped back and ran for the security room. My pulse surged in my ears, the darkness of the hallway seeming to stretch farther and farther as I ran. I didn't dare look behind me. My only focus was on the light from the security room, glowing faintly at the far end of the hall. I reached the door and flung it open, my hands shaking as I locked it behind me. But even as I stood in the safety of the small room, I could feel the presence. It wasn't in the hallway anymore. It had followed me. The walls felt thinner now, like the house was pressing in from every side. I hurried to the security panel, checking the cameras. The mansion, which had seemed empty for so long, was suddenly alive. The feeds were flickering, the image of each room jumping and distorting like a broken television screen. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my throat as I saw something move in one of the camera frames. Something behind the camera. In one of the rooms, a shadow that didn't belong there. It moved across the screen far too quickly to be natural. I pressed the button to switch to another feed, but it was the same. The figure, now larger, more distinct, was pacing from room to room, its outline shifting in and out of focus. "You can't hide," the voice whispered from the speaker, so close that it felt like it was in the room with me. I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the security room. It was coming from the monitors themselves. The sound wasn't distorted. It was clear, precise, and chilling. The camera feed flickered again, and the shadow was standing in front of the camera. I couldn't make out any details except for its shape. A tall, thin figure with long limbs, dark like the shadows themselves. The figure tilted its head as if looking directly at me. "You can't hide from us." My blood ran cold. I slammed my hand against the control panel, trying to shut off the feed, but the images wouldn't stop. The figure moved again, coming closer to the camera, its silhouette growing larger as it pressed itself against the glass. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. And then the screen went black. I sat there in stunned silence, my breath shaky, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. The house felt too quiet again, the kind of silence that presses in, suffocating. But even as the room seemed to return to its calm state, I knew the danger hadn't passed. The door to the security room was locked, but it didn't matter anymore. I could feel it. Something was already inside the house with me. Something that had been waiting, watching, and now it was moving closer. The rules were simple, Evelyn had said, but now I knew they were the only thing standing between me and whatever force had been lurking in Blackthorn Manor for all these years. I had to follow them. I had to survive the night. But I also knew that no rule could protect me from the darkness that was closing in. The room was silent once again, but the silence felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The unease that had settled in my chest was only getting worse. The whispering voices still echoed in my mind, lingering like a fog, and the shadow on the camera feed still haunted me. It had been too quick, too deliberate to be just a trick of the mind. Someone was here with me. I knew I needed answers. The mansion's history, the warnings Evelyn had given me, the strange behavior of the house itself, all of it pointed to something far darker than a simple haunting. Blackthorn Manor wasn't just old, it was cursed. But I couldn't go any further without understanding why it was cursed, what had happened here, and what I was up against. I couldn't survive the night without knowing how to break the cycle. I remembered the bookshelves in the main hallway, the dusty old volumes lining the walls, each one a piece of the mansion's history. I had noticed the old portraits of long-dead family members staring down at me, their eyes lifeless and unmoving. It seemed like every part of the mansion had been preserved in time, as if it were waiting for something, for someone. I stood up from the security desk, the coldness in the room clinging to my skin. The footsteps that had been haunting me earlier were no longer audible, but I could feel them. I could feel them in the walls. It was time to investigate. I had no other choice. I moved through the hallways, the floor creaking beneath my boots, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every shadow seemed to shift and warp with the light, making the mansion feel like it was alive, its very walls breathing. The coldness of the house pressed against me, and every corner I passed seemed to have eyes. The bookshelves were as old as the mansion itself, each shelf sagging under the weight of time. I ran my hand along the spines of the books, many of them yellowed with age, their titles barely legible. Some were religious texts, others medical journals, some volumes about local history. But one book caught my eye. Its leather cover cracked and worn, the title written in faded gold lettering, The Blackthorn Legacy. I pulled it from the shelf and opened it. The pages were brittle, each one fragile under my fingertips, but the words were still legible. The book chronicled the history of Blackthorn Manor, but as I read, a sense of dread settled over me. The family that had built the mansion was founded by a man named Gregory Blackthorn, an ambitious landowner who came from nothing but wanted everything. His obsession with power had led him to study the occult, ancient rituals, and the afterlife. But it wasn't just the occult that intrigued him. It was death itself, how to control it. According to the journal, Blackthorn had made a deal with something that wasn't human. In his quest to unlock the mysteries of life and death, he had summoned an entity, an ancient being who thrived on fear, pain, and suffering. Blackthorn had opened a door between this world and whatever lay beyond it, and in doing so he had trapped himself and his family in a prison of their own making. The entity that Blackthorn had called forth, the one that had answered his invitation, didn't just come to him. It took hold of the entire house, using it as a conduit for its power. The Blackthorn family had become its puppets, and every guest who stayed at the mansion was doomed to become another soul trapped within its grasp. The spirits I had been hearing, the ones calling out for help, were victims of the same curse. Blackthorn's descendants had tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy, but the mansion itself had become a prison, feeding off the fear of those who had entered and never left. I flipped through the pages, scanning through the rest of the book. It was clear that Blackthorn had tried to reverse the curse. He had tried to perform rituals to banish the entity, but nothing had worked. The curse was too strong, too ingrained in the very fabric of the mansion. The last entry was written in a frantic, shaking hand, and it sent chills down my spine. I've seen it. The entity. It has taken on the form of one of my descendants. It wears their face and speaks with their voice. I can't escape it. I've tried to destroy the house, but it will not burn. It will not die. It will not let me go. I am trapped here, just like everyone else. I hear its whispers now, feel its presence every moment. Please, if anyone reads this, do not come. Do not step foot in Blackthorn Manor. It is cursed, and it will consume you. The last sentence was smudged with dark ink, as if someone had hurriedly written it in their last moments. I closed the book with shaking hands, a feeling of nausea settling in my gut. The entity, the curse, it was real. I wasn't just dealing with restless spirits, I was dealing with something much darker, and it had been waiting for someone to come. It had been waiting for me. I stood there in the dark hallway, the weight of the book in my hands. The air in the mansion had shifted again. It was colder now, and I could feel the presence of the entity in the walls, in the very stones beneath my feet. The whispers were louder now, too, as if the spirits knew I was beginning to understand what had happened here. The mansion wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding off the fear of the living and the dead. And now, I was part of it. I needed to leave. I needed to break the curse. But I had no idea how. Every door, every window, every shadow seemed to be trapping me in place. The entity was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. As I looked around the hallway, the walls seemed to stretch farther, the darkness closing in. The whispers grew louder still. Help us. Release us. You can't leave. You belong to us now. I gripped the book tightly in my hands, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was already pulling me in. The walls, the whispers, they were all part of the mansion, part of the entity that had been feeding off the fear for centuries. And now, I was its newest victim. I didn't know how long I stood there, in the dark hallway of Blackthorn Manor, gripping the old book in my hands, but it felt like hours. The whispering grew louder, more desperate, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer as the walls of the house tightened around me. The weight of the entity, the one that had been feeding on this mansion for so long, pressed down on me. I could feel it in the air, suffocating, cold, and alive. The mansion wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the past. It was being manipulated by something darker, a force that had been awakened by Blackthorn's reckless pursuit of immortality. The whispers were no longer just voices from the past. They were calls. Calls to the entity. Calls to me, begging me to understand what had happened here. You can't leave. The words came from nowhere, filling my mind like a voice that had crawled out of the walls themselves. You belong here now. I spun around, my flashlight flickering, but there was nothing. The hall was empty, just the same portraits of long-dead Blackthorn ancestors staring down at me, their eyes seeming more alive, more focused than before. The walls seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding as though the house itself was responding to the growing power within it. I stumbled backward, almost dropping the book, as the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. I whipped around, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. just the deepening darkness that seemed to spread across the walls, swallowing up the light from my flashlight. And then I heard it again. "Help us." The voice came from the farthest end of the hallway, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't the voice of the spirits this time. It was deeper, darker, more resonant, as if it were coming from the very bones of the house itself. I felt the coldness seeping into my skin, the walls pressing in around me like they were closing in, like they were ready to trap me here forever. The footsteps grew louder, but they weren't coming from the hallway anymore. They were coming from within the walls, from beneath the floorboards. The house was shifting, groaning with age and power, and as the walls seemed to close in on me, I realized that the entity, whatever it was here, moving through the very foundation of Blackthorn Manor. "You can't escape." The voice echoed again, louder now, the presence growing stronger, pulling me toward the heart of the house. "You've opened the door. You've woken us." The whispers shifted. They were no longer just pleading for release. They were angry, hungry. I looked down at the book I was holding, feeling its weight in my hands. There had to be a way to stop this. There had to be a way to close the door, to stop the curse from feeding, to release the spirits that were trapped here. But the more I read, the more I realized that Blackthorn had already done something that couldn't be undone. He had opened the gateway to something else, something that had no place in the world of the living. As if responding to my thoughts, the lights above me flickered, then went out entirely. The mansion was plunged into total darkness. The only sound, the soft rustling of the pages in the book and the sound of my own breathing. A sudden pressure filled the room, as if the air itself was being squeezed out of the space. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My chest tightened and I gasped for air, but the pressure seemed to increase, suffocating me. And then, from the darkness, I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form tall and thin, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel the weight of its gaze pressing down like a physical force. The air turned even colder as the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was made of shadows themselves. But this wasn't a ghost. This wasn't one of the spirits trapped here. This was something else. The figure opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, twisted teeth, and it spoke in a voice that was both familiar and alien. "You can't close the door." The words hit me like a slap, and I staggered backward, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't stay here any longer. The mansion was alive, feeding off the energy of the spirits, feeding off me. It wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, one that held more than just ghosts. I looked back down at the book, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. There had to be a way to break the curse. There had to be a way to close the gateway before the entity consumed me, before it consumed everyone who entered this cursed place. But the more I read, the more I realized that the curse wasn't just tied to the house, it was tied to the very land itself, and I had no idea how to stop it. The night was suffocating, thick with dread and the heavy weight of the unknown. The mansion, with its creaking walls and ancient hollow rooms, had become more than just a building. It was alive, an entity in itself, its heart beating in time with the whispers of the spirits trapped within it. I could no longer ignore the fact that whatever force haunted Blackthorn Manor, whatever curse had been set in motion, was not just haunting the place, it was controlling it. I had come to the mansion for a simple job, a night watchman, and in my naivety, I had thought that the worst I would face would be boredom and the occasional odd noise. But I had stepped into something far darker. The rules Evelyn had given me. Stay in the security room after midnight. Don't open the west door. Don't investigate the noises in the walls. Had felt like precautions. Simple, sensible guidelines. But now, after everything I had experienced, I knew they weren't just suggestions. They were lifelines. And I had already broken one of them. I had left the security room. I hadn't investigated the shadows, but I had let my curiosity get the better of me. I had opened doors, listened to voices, and followed the strange pulling sensation that seemed to come from the mansion itself. And now, I was deep inside its belly, surrounded by its darkness, with the curse closing in. The knowledge was too much to bear, but it also gave me clarity. I had no time left. The spirits, the entity, the mansion, none of it was going to let me leave. The longer I stayed, the stronger the pull became. The mansion was feeding on me, feeding on my fear, my desire for answers. I could feel it in every breath, in every creak of the floorboards beneath me. I had no choice. If I wanted to survive the night, I had to break the rules again. I had to find a way to close the gate. The west door. Evelyn had warned me against it, saying it was the key, the source of everything. But I had seen the figure in the shadows, heard the entity's voice. I knew now that the mansion was more than just a haunted house. It was a living, breathing thing that had been built around a cursed door. And that door, locked away behind layers of fear and forgotten warnings, was the gateway between worlds. I couldn't stay in the security room any longer. I couldn't just wait for whatever was going to happen. If I wanted to leave, if I wanted to break the curse, I had to face it. I had to face the door. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and cold. The shadows seemed to bend toward me, as if urging me to follow. I had no idea what I would find behind the west door, but I knew that I had to confront whatever it was. I could already hear the tapping, the rhythmic knock of something moving just beyond the door, just beyond the walls. The mansion was alive with it, alive with the whispers. I reached the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The door was just as I remembered it. Heavy, dark wood, framed with ancient carvings. The lock was intricate, made of brass that had tarnished over the years, but I could feel the cold, insistent pull from within. I knew that I had to open it. I didn't know what would happen once I did, but there was no going back. My fingers wrapped around the cold brass handle. It was alive beneath my touch, humming with energy, vibrating with the power of the curse. I could feel the door waiting, as if it had been waiting for me all along. It was the source of everything, the heart of the mansion's power. I took a deep breath and twisted the handle. The door opened with a slow creak, the air rushing out like it had been trapped for centuries. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the floor. The room beyond was dark, but I could feel the presence in it. The air was heavier here, thick with something ancient and cold. It smelled like dust, like decay, but there was something else underneath, the scent of something old, something buried. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The room was larger than I had expected, stretching back into darkness. At the far end of the room, a large, ornate mirror stood against the wall. The glass was cracked, its surface fractured in several places, but it still seemed to reflect the dim light from my flashlight. It was like a portal, a window into another world. And that's when I saw it, the figure, a shadow in the reflection. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't just my imagination. The figure was standing in the mirror, watching me. Its face was distorted, its features hidden in the reflection, but I could see the movement, its eyes following me, its smile widening into something too unnatural to ignore. The mirror shimmered as if it were alive, and I felt the weight of it pull at me, drawing me closer, dragging me into its depths. The whispers grew louder now, their words indistinguishable, but their intent clear. The mansion wanted me. The entity wanted me. I took another step, and the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to move as though it were reacting to my presence. The walls groaned in protest, and the sound of the knocking, the tapping, grew louder, more insistent. The figure in the mirror began to move, its shape growing clearer with each passing second. It wasn't a man, it wasn't human, it was a thing, a presence, and I could feel its eyes on me, piercing into my soul. "Help me," it whispered again, but this time the voice wasn't in the air, it was in my head. And then I knew what had to be done. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was a prison, and the gate had to be closed. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the mirror's cold surface, ready to face whatever was waiting on the other side. The mirror was cold beneath my fingers, its surface vibrating with a strange energy that seemed to pulse through me. I could feel the force behind it, the weight of the curse that had bound this place for centuries, the lingering presence of the entity that had taken hold of Blackthorn Manor. It wasn't just a haunted house, it was a trap. The figure in the reflection moved again, its eyes locking with mine, its smile widening into something grotesque. It wasn't a man or a woman. It wasn't even human. It was something darker, something ancient, with an energy that felt like it had existed long before the house was even built. The whispers around me grew louder, their voices blending into a dissonant chorus of anger, desperation, and hunger. "You've awakened us." The voice was not from the figure, but from within the house itself, as if the walls were speaking. The ground trembled beneath my feet. I staggered back, but the mirror seemed to pull me in, drawing me forward with an irresistible force. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to step away, but I couldn't. The mansion had its grip on me now. The walls pressed in from every side, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching toward me like dark hands. "You are part of it now," the voice whispered again, its cold breath crawling into my ears. "There is no escape. You belong to Blackthorn." I had come to understand what the entity truly was. It wasn't just a spirit or a ghost. It was a force of corruption, an ancient evil that had taken root in the very foundation of the house. It had fed on fear, on suffering for centuries. And now it was feeding on me. But I refused to let it take me. I took a step forward, feeling the air grow colder, the shadows pressing against me. The entity in the mirror, the thing, was watching me, its smile growing wider, its form becoming clearer. It was no longer just an apparition. It was real. The mansion was alive, and it was feeding on my fear, my panic. The more I felt trapped, the stronger it became. But then, as I stood there, my eyes locked on the reflection of the figure, something shifted. A sudden clarity washed over me. I wasn't just looking at a mirror, I was looking at the gateway, the portal that had been opened all those years ago by Gregory Blackthorn. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a haunting presence, it was the key to closing the door. The rules had been clear all along. I had to confront it. I had to close the gate. I took a deep breath and reached out, my fingers trembling as I grasped the edges of the mirror. The glass rippled beneath my touch, and a wave of cold, bone-deep terror washed over me. The thing in the reflection, the entity, lunged forward, its hands pressing against the glass from the other side. I could feel its weight, its power pressing against me, but I couldn't let it take me. I pulled the mirror off the wall with all the strength I could muster, and for a moment, everything shuddered. The mansion seemed to groan, its very foundation shaking as the energy in the room shifted. The figure in the mirror let out a sound, an inhuman scream that echoed through the house, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I threw the mirror to the ground, the sound of it shattering into 1,000 pieces filling the air. The room seemed to quake as the figure, the entity, let out a final, terrifying wail. The walls of the house trembled, and I could feel the air around me shift, break, like something was finally being set free. The mansion groaned, the windows rattling, the shadows pulling away from the walls. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, like a breath held too long, the mansion exhaled. The oppressive presence that had hung over the place for so long seemed to lift, and the weight pressing on my chest released. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The shadows around me receded, and the house seemed to breathe again, no longer suffocating, no longer alive with the malevolent energy that had consumed it for so long. The walls that had once felt like they were closing in, now felt empty. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady as I looked around the room. The house was still. The whispers, the voices, they were gone. The clowns, the spirits, the entity, they were no longer here. The curse had been broken. I turned toward the door, the one that had once seemed so far out of reach, and walked toward it. For the first time, the mansion felt like a place that had been freed from its chains. The cold had lifted, and the oppressive silence that had filled the house now felt peaceful, like the calm after a storm. But as I stepped through the door, I couldn't help but feel one last, lingering thought. The mansion had been sealed for now, its curse broken, but the memories, the presence of the entity, lingered in the back of my mind. I knew, deep down, that the mansion had not been vanquished. It had simply been quieted for a time. I left Blackthorn Manor that night. The gates finally opened to me, and I didn't look back. I had survived. But I knew that somewhere in the shadows of that old house, something was still watching, waiting. And one day, someone else would wander too close, and the cycle would begin again.